Dr. Kiana Scott, how you doing today?
I'm doing great. How are you doing, Dr. David Donkey?
I am so good, so good. It is raining and dark in Seattle, and I feel like it's fall. All right.
It's cold now. It's perfect weather to in our beautiful state to sit inside and make phone calls and text bank and write postcards to voters and plan your trips to maybe sunnier climates to do some door knocking.
Totally true. It is October 8th. It's in the morning. And I asked you to come on the podcast, our Withcp podcast today, to talk about a really interesting media strategy that Vice President Kamala Harris is engaging in, who she's talking to, what audiences, why. And it's a real big push this in the last 10 days, right now and in the last 10 days. So I want to start with, and I want to talk about some different entities that she's been talking to and doing interviews with. But I want to start with the one that I'd never heard of, okay, until 5 days ago. And that's the point, I think. All right. Call Her Daddy. What the heck is Call Her Daddy?
Yeah, so no shock that this hasn't been on your radar because this is not for you. Call Her Daddy is a podcast that has been around for a couple of years now. Previously hosted by two young women, now hosted by one young woman, Alex Cooper, who we'll certainly talk about more as we have this conversation. But it's the number 2 podcast on Spotify. Huge
In the
audience
world. In the
in the
world.
world, in the
Yeah.
world. Yeah. It's part of the Barstool Media empire. There was a controversy around this a couple of years ago. But I mention that because the vibe of Call Her Daddy fits into the sort of fratty ethos of this media company. This is not Pod Save America. This is not NPR politics. This is a podcast for and by young women about relationships, about sex, about intimacy, about mental health, about well-being. This is not a politics podcast. So this is I'll actually just pause and say Joe Biden would never go on this podcast.
Exactly.
Ever, right? He wouldn't know what it is. He wouldn't know how to be there. He wouldn't be a good guest. He wouldn't be of interest to the people who are listening. Kamala Harris was an awesome choice to go on this podcast because she can engage with the audience here, but they are not people who are coming to her rallies. She's going to them. They're not coming to her. And that's
Right.
really the theme of this week, right? She's going out and finding audiences who she can't get, who she isn't getting to come to her rallies.
Exactly. And so to set the stage for the rest of this episode, uh, last week Kamala Harris did an interview conversation on another podcast called All the Smoke that is hosted by two National Basketball Association players. And it's about sports. It's about marijuana and weed. That's what the All the Smoke is referring to. It's about life among these kind of people who have certain means and affluence in this kind of high celebrity space. She went on there. Then she goes on Call Her Daddy. Then she does the 60 Minutes interview last night, which is probably the demographic that most of the people listening to this podcast they would like familiar with that one.
And that one's also traditional, right?
Exactly. That's
Yeah,
totally
that's
traditional.
that's expected,
Right. So
which is interesting in this week.
she's hitting these different islands of media, right? So All the Smoke hits one body of folks, more men, particularly men of color. All right. Call Her Daddy is a podcast that particularly appeals to women, as you said, looking at the demographics of who listens to this, according to some NPR research, 70% women are in the audience. The audience is 70% women. 76% of the audience is under the age of 35. And politically, it's 48% Democratic, 24% Republican, 20% Independent. That's a hell of a demographic if you're trying to reach out politically across the ways. And then 34% live in the South, 24% in the West. Like, this is just the kind of thing that candidates don't generally do. Okay, so hold on to that for a second. Then she does 60 Minutes, which is a traditional broadcast message. All right. Then she's doing The View. She just did it about an hour ago.
Hasn't even aired in our time zone yet. Airing soon.
Exactly. She's just did The View, which of course appeals to a mid-morning professional women and also people rearing children as well. Okay.
And it's one of the most watched daytime shows in our
Sure.
country. Huge
Okay, great.
audience.
Great. And then she's going to go on the Howard Stern show today. All right. That's like 90% male. All right. And high Northeast quadrant, but it's also Sirius on Sirius, Sirius radio. It's national. And then she's doing the Colbert Show tonight. All right. So she's doing all of these spaces, and you might expect a candidate to do 60 minutes. We might expect a candidate to get on The View if they can, and to do the Colbert Show. All right. But the All the Smoke, Call Her Daddy, and Howard Stern show, those are risks and strategic choices. So if you were in the mind of the Harris campaign, why are they on these shows? Let's go back to the point you were making. Why did they go on these three shows?
Yeah, so they've had, just thinking back to the brief months that Kamala Harris has been the presidential nominee, she's had the Democratic National Convention. She's had this huge surge of enthusiasm at her rallies, right? But she hasn't been doing traditional media interviews. She's really been using social media to spread her message. She's been using her rallies to spread her message. She's been having tremendous fundraising success. And she's sort of jumped on these big moments, selecting Tim Walz as vice
Yeah.
president, accepting the Democratic nomination for president, like all of these things. Those are speaking to pretty captive audiences. Like you and I were enthralled by everything to date, right? What she's not catching has been my neighbor across the street, who's a mom of 3 little kids, who is super busy and isn't watching the DNC every day. What she's not capturing is, I don't know who listens to the Howard Stern show because we're just very different people, but that's the point, right? She's not capturing the Howard Stern show audience. She's not capturing the In the Smoke audience. These aren't people who are going to generally, and I'm making broad assumptions here, like I'm just going to state that up front. She is using these podcasts and some of these opportunities to go to her audience rather than asking them to come to her. And she's doing it in a really smart and intelligent way. Not only is she going out and reaching new audiences via these channels, but she's getting a ton of media coverage about the fact that she's going out to these different audiences. You Google Kamala Harris this morning, and every single story is about this outreach that she's doing, about this proactive engagement, about how she's going out and taking her message to people. And you look on her social media, you see the messages that her campaign is putting out into the world. They are well chosen snippets from these interviews. And they'll be able to roll that out in the coming weeks, and they will be able to piggyback on the audiences of each of these different shows to reach them that way as well. So her Instagram is full of clips from her interview on Call Your Daddy just a day or two ago. That's also on the Call Her Daddy Instagram.
Yeah.
That's not just reaching out to the folks Kamala Harris is sending it to, it's reaching out to the folks the Call Her Daddy podcast is sending it out to. So I think this is a really smart strategic move. Frankly, I wish she'd done it earlier because this is a really smart thing to do. But I'm so glad she's doing it now.
One thing that you get when you do these kind of targeted interviews is you also get a more thoughtful conversation, right? It's not a journalist who is trying to make their name or show their journalist bona fides by asking you these gotcha questions or tougher questions. You get a more thoughtful conversation. So as an example of this, I want to show one of the clips that have come out of the Call Her Daddy interview. Alex Cooper asks a question of Kamala Harris. This is being put up by the Harris campaign on their social media. That's why, like, I haven't listened to the podcast, so I know about it because I've seen the clips. And I was really struck by the depth of this answer that she put forward. So I want to, this is like a 2-minute answer. All right. And so
Before we show it, can I just make one point here? The two of them are facing each other.
Right.
This podcast was being filmed, and those are the clips that the campaign that Call Her Daddy is using. They show a poised but comfortable, seated Kamala Harris laughing and engaging directly with Alex Cooper, who is sitting there in all of her podcast gear and stuff, wearing a hooded sweatshirt.
Yeah.
This is a very, very different environment than a nominating convention, then a presidential debate, then a campaign rally. This looks like a conversation, maybe not between friends because there's such a generational difference, but between people who are interested in hearing what the other person is saying. It looks comfortable. It looks easeful for both of them. And I think that's a really important part of why they're doing this.
That's great. And as a contrast to the 60 Minutes interview, which I've seen clips of also, where it's the men who are interviewing who are in ties and they're sitting formally, right? Yeah.
Yep.
That's great. Thank you for sharing it. By the way, I think I forgot to mention that Dr. Kiana Scott is the head of Kiana Scott Strategies. All right. It's a consulting organization here in town that you created, that you run, and it's works heavily in the civic, the political, the philanthropic space around strategies and kind of just effective ways to make a difference. So just everybody, like, once you're done listening to Dr. Kiana Scott, go hire her. Okay. All right. So here's a clip from Call Her Daddy. I love that you just set it up that way too. Kiana, let's see.
I do want to clarify something. In the debate, former President Trump claimed that some states are executing babies after birth. Can you just clarify?
That is not happening anywhere in the United States. It is not happening, and it's a lie. It's a bold-faced lie that he is suggesting that. Can you imagine? He is suggesting that women in their 9th month of pregnancy are electing to have an abortion. Are you kidding? That is so outrageously inaccurate, and it's so insulting to suggest that would be happening and that women would be doing that. It's not happening anywhere. This guy is full of lies. I mean, I just have to be very candid with you. So in my career, from the time I got out of law school through most of my career as a prosecutor, I understood that the words that I spoke and what I did with those words would be the difference between whether somebody was charged with a crime or went to prison, maybe prison for life. When I was Attorney General, I was the top law enforcement officer of the biggest state in this country. And I was acutely aware that the words I spoke could be the difference between whether a corporation was in business or out of business, that the words I spoke could move markets. The idea that someone is not only so careless and irresponsible and reckless, but out and out lies to create fear and division in our country and thinks he should be president of the United States standing behind the seal of the president of the United States using the microphone that comes with that and using that voice and those words in such an irresponsible, and that's mild, way. And this is why this election matters.
Okay. I just love everything about that answer. She did something from a communication perspective. She drove a narrative in that answer. She took an answer, a question, and drove a narrative. And that means you have to continue your sentences. You have to complete your sentences. You have to know what the next sentence is going to be. You have to, like, you see the arc. I am going from this to this, and I'm going to get there. and I'm going to stay on topic using this topic. So from a pure strategic perspective, it's beautiful. She also would never get that much time in a regular interview. They'd never give her those pauses. In a debate, she'd never get that chance. And so this is a space in the podcast and Call Her Daddy that she gets to drive that message and have a woman who's highly respected, Alex Cooper, across from her listening, clearly listening.
But isn't political, but
Right.
isn't a political pundit, which I think is a huge point, right? The people that she usually interviews are celebrities or people in the wellness industry or mental health experts. She isn't a political pundit. This isn't a politics podcast. She's not really having a politics conversation with Kamala Harris, although, of course, everything is political. She's having a conversation about the future, and she's having a conversation about how we see the world.
Yeah.
Just as she does with her other audience members. So I don't mean to interrupt, but I think it's just so
you're right.
important
It's
that
absolutely,
she
you're right.
isn't a political, she's not an investigative journalist, she's not a political reporter, she is not a political expert. She's a really good interviewer.
Yeah. 5 million people listen weekly to that podcast. It's number 2 in the world behind Joe Rogan, the Joe Rogan Experience. And this ability to reach what we'll call less politically engaged or low political information voters is key to winning this election. All right. And Donald Trump has been spectacular in meeting those voters for 8 years because of his shenanigans and all he says and the racism and the sexism that's always present. It cuts through to these voters. And so here Harris is doing it. She's doing it on Call Her Daddy. She's doing it on All the Smoke, especially. She's going to do it on the Howard Stern show too later today. So at the beginning of that interview of Call Her Daddy and at the beginning of the 60 Minutes interview, the hosts, Alex Cooper and on 60 Minutes, Scott Pelley, explain why they did this interview with Kamala Harris. And they both note that they invited Donald Trump to do this interview. The Call Her Daddy explanation by Alex Cooper, I just find so valuable. I'm not going to show it here, but it's if you want to do a Google search, just go find Alex Cooper explains. Okay, it's 2 minutes of explanation of why she, a non-political person, decided to do these interviews, and they invited Harris and Trump. All right, Trump.
And it's how she opens her podcast. So if you're a regular listener who just subscribes on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or whatever, and you're going about your day in your routine, listening to podcasts, and this pops on, you start with that framing of why she, as someone you listen to, wants you to hear this conversation.
Yeah.
She wanted to have this conversation. It doesn't catch you out of the blue. And she also makes a really strong case for why it's important to have this conversation and how it isn't usual for her. So it really invites her regular listeners, again, 5 million or whatever it is, to try something new and hear this. It's quite masterfully done, both for her and for both in terms of welcoming her listeners to this new thing she's doing and in setting up a key difference between Trump and Harris, which is that she's doing it and he isn't responding.
Yeah, she really shepherds Harris. And I think she would have done this intro for both. Like if Trump had said yes, it would have been there for both of them.
Absolutely.
She shepherds them into her world and extends her credibility about why this is important.
Yeah, and she does it while maintaining her own voice and brand throughout. This is not a Kamala Harris segment of, a Kamala Harris sponsored segment of Call Her Daddy.
Yeah.
This is Alex Cooper referring to her listeners as Daddy Gang, which is how she refers to them.
Exactly.
Which I don't think I can imagine saying that in front of the Vice President of the United States of America, but she's maintaining that this is her space. She's welcoming Kamala Harris into her space. She also, at the beginning of that segment, outlines that there were no questions off limits, no areas that they couldn't go, and that she was the one driving the conversation.
She said she prepared 6 different versions of the interview. I just have so much respect for Alex Cooper. So Trump not going on this, not doing the debate, a second debate, not going on 60 Minutes either, not only gives Harris all this positive space, it shatters the mythology of Trump will like take all comers, handle everybody. I'm a macho dude. I'll handle everybody, right? So you're not only from the Harris campaign getting the positivity of her ability to control her message in these very targeted spaces. Trump is getting, I wouldn't call it outright hostile coverage, but it is not positive for sure.
There's a vacuum, and that's being filled by questions about his age, by questions about his well-being. There are no new policies being, released from the Trump campaign.
Yeah.
Harris is using her appearance on The View today to release a new policy around home health workers and home care workers that is specifically intended to address the demographic of The View. I mean, so it's really, she's feeding two birds with one stone, and Trump is just not present.
Yeah. So I want to show how this plays out in a negative way for Trump. I want to share half of the introduction on 60 Minutes. The first half we're not going to see is where Scott Pelley says, every single candidate running for the president. So what does he say, Kiana?
It's something like every single candidate running for president has appeared on this show since, I think, 1984. This is a very well-established stop on the presidential campaign train. You have a debate, you go on 60 Minutes.
Yep. And so then Pelley goes into saying how it is that Trump's not here, why it is that he's not here. And I love it.
We agreed. On September 9th, Trump's communications director, Stephen Chung, sent a text that read, quote, "I'm working with our advance team to see logistically if Butler would work in addition to the sit-down." Sit-down meaning the interview in Florida. Days later, Chung called to say, quote, "The president said yes." Then, a week ago, Trump backed out. The campaign...
And that phrasing is such a frame that Trump backed out, right? I love it.
Offered shifting explanations. First, it complained that we would fact-check the interview. We fact-check every story. Later, Trump said he needed an apology for his interview in 2020. Trump claims correspondent Leslie Stahl said in that interview that Hunter Biden's controversial laptop came from Russia. She never said that. Trump has said his opponent doesn't do interviews because she can't handle them. He had previously declined another debate with Harris, so tonight may have been the largest audience for the candidates between now and Election Day. Our questions addressed the economy, immigration, reproductive rights, and the wars in the Middle East and Europe. Both campaigns understood this special would go ahead if either candidate backed out. We agreed.
All right. So as we begin to close up this episode, I want to really draw attention to the terminology that Pelley's using. So journalists in what we'll call the legacy media don't say words like backed out, complained, and absolutely just side by side say we fact checked everybody, unless they're one, peeved, okay, and two, just lost respect. And so Trump lost a lot, and that message right there for everybody watching this podcast just went out to everybody you want it to go out to, okay?
Yeah, I mean, this was a self-goal for Trump, right? Because not only is he not taking advantage of this huge, and again, very expected platform, reaching a lot of people who he needs to reach, but he made them mad, and they are telling all of those people why they're mad and how Trump can't be trusted in this instance. That's information that's really relevant. And that's information that Trump doesn't really want them to share.
So Biden would do the 60-minute interview. You said that earlier
Yeah.
in the podcast. He would do the 60-minute interview. He would go on The View. He was on The View just so
He was the first sitting vice president to go on The View, in fact.
Okay. So he would do The View and he would do 60 Minutes. He
Yeah.
would not do All the Smoke, Call Her Daddy, or Howard Stern Show. So tell us, Kiana, please, as help Common Power Nation to understand why Harris not just is doing this, but why it's so essential that she do it to win this election.
Well, this election is close, right? We are operating on razor thin margins. And I am a firm believer that the only poll that matters is election day. I'm not paying attention to the polls, but the Harris campaign sure is. And they are making these strategic decisions about how their candidate is spending her time and who she is talking to based on where they think they can move the needle in ways that support their work. So Harris has a very big job, right? She is sitting vice president of the United States of America. There is a crisis happening on the eastern seaboard. There's a huge hurricane about to hit that looks like it's going to devastate parts of Florida. There are crises in the Middle East that she's engaged on. She is juggling a lot in her day job. She is also running for president. That's its own more than full-time job. She is traveling around the country. She is holding events. She's doing a whole bunch of things behind the scenes that you and I don't see, right? She's raising money. She's building out policy proposals. She's connecting with coalitions in different states. Every moment that she has is precious. The fact that she is spending this much time not only appearing on these different platforms, but preparing for these different platforms, because preparing for the Howard Stern Show is very different than preparing for The View, right? And preparing for 60 Minutes is very different than preparing for All the Smoke or Call Her Daddy. So she's doing deep work to get ready for each platform, to articulate her narrative, to frame her message in a way that will resonate with that audience. There is nothing more precious, fewer than 30 days out from an election, than the candidate's time. And the investment of her time to this degree in this many forms of media outreach tells you the campaign thinks this is not only effective, but essential. So she's really using this as an opportunity to connect with voters, with prospective but not current voters, with potential donors maybe, with people who may influence others, because she thinks this is going to make a difference.
I'm going to end with this question. You're an expert, and I've been fortunate to work with you around gender and politics. Okay. So women running in office, the presentations of masculinity and femininity in American politics. It seems to me that there's also a subtext in these targeted interviews of gender as well. Okay. She's on Call Her Daddy, speaking with a young woman. She's on The View with all women hosts. When she goes on Howard Stern is like the caricature of a man, right? So you get to like talk raunchy a little bit back and forth with her, that so-called hip young females do. All right. So is there a way, because she is not running an overtly woman for president campaign. She is not.
Her gender is not her focus.
Right. Her gender is not her focus, but it is a subtext that seems to me to come visibly present more in these spaces than if she's in a debate.
I would agree with that. And I also think we're just seeing that Kamala Harris can engage in really different ways. She is comfortable in a multitude of settings in a way that Trump is not.
Yeah.
Trump just sort of stands there like a dolt, regardless of the circumstances, right? He might be a little more fiery sometimes. He might be golfing at other times, but that's really it. You know that if he's not the one speaking, he's just going to sit there with that sort of dour expression. Kamala Harris can engage authentically and compellingly in really different ways in different environments. And we're seeing her demonstrate that. So she had a really thoughtful conversation on Call Her Daddy. There was a lot of connection. There was a lot of emotional resonance. I imagine that's going to be true of The View. She's going to really display her empathy. She's rolling out this policy around home care workers and home health workers that's specifically targeting families who are caring for both kids and aging parents. She's gonna get that. She's gonna show that that resonates with her. On Howard Stern, on the Colbert Report, presumably on on All the Smoke, which I didn't listen to, she's going to show that she has a sense of humor. She's fun. She's funny. She's engaging. She's a good time. She has a multitude of different, not personalities because they're all her, but a multitude of different ways that she can engage depending on the situation.
Yeah.
A big part of that does come down to gender, and there are openings there that we are only seeing now because a woman is doing this work, right? It does look different having Joe Biden on The View, surrounded by the women who are the hosts of that show, asking them questions, and answering their questions, than it does Kamala Harris sitting around talking to a bunch of women of her broad demographic, right? That looks really different. They know that. They don't have to be explicit about that. They can just say Kamala Harris is going on The View for the 8th time or something, and that comes across. So yeah, there's no escaping from the gendered dynamic and gendered performance that Kamala Harris has to engage with, but she's doing so in a really subtle way. Call Her Daddy was the most explicit, was one of the most explicit platforms I've seen her engage in, where she talked about women and about the role of women in this election. And she gave, and I'm gonna keep going. This is a long answer to your question, but she talked a lot about the importance of women not being humble, women standing up for themselves.
Yeah.
And that's not something she's done in a lot of other contexts. She was able to do that in that context, knowing that that will really resonate with the more than 70% of women who are that show's listeners.
Yeah. That's really insightful. Thank you for all that. I think I think this is a winning media strategy. I think it is. I don't think that we can make an argument that Trump's approach is a winning media strategy. It doesn't mean he can't win, but the reality is it's not what you do if you're gonna, it's not the pathway to winning. And Harris, I'm really, really happy and I feel just glad to support her. Like, this is great. And her media strategy and also her integrity in the way I love the way that you say it. She can engage in multiple platforms with multiple people in different ways and still all be authentically herself.
Well, at the end of the day, the president is the president of the entire United States of America, right? Whether they voted for her or not, whether they voted or not, whether they agree with her on everything or not. She has to be able to enter different spaces and demonstrate that she can listen to different people. That's exactly what she's doing right now.
Yeah. All right, Dr. Kiana Scott, thank you so much for dropping by the pod. Okay.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, Dr. David Domke. Talk to you soon.
See you later. Bye.
Bye.